So I want to read a passage from the book, which is really the first part of the book that I wrote, because it seemed to me that this was central to the entire story, and that is a point at which 2 UN officers trapped behind the lines inside the siege zone are forced to take shelter from a government bombardment. And in the morning they emerge and they see that the government bombardment has in fact killed many civilians. Looking through the ventilation peepholes, he could see the shells exploding where thousands of refugees were camped. He saw one shell tear apart a small hut housing humanitarian workers who had been distributing food and water that afternoon. About 2 hours after the bombardment began, a shell exploded so close that Harun thought that their shelter had taken a direct hit. His head reeled and he was unable to hear for a few seconds. Something heavy had struck the entrance of the bunker. He heard moaning and cries for help and peered outside through the ventilation peephole. It was, he said, a 130 shell impact, just where the old man's family had been. The bodies were lying there, quiet and limp across each other. Embers from the scattered fire glowed. 2 or 3 people were calling for help, but the shelling was so intense that we couldn't leave. The moaning gradually stopped as they bled to death. There was nothing we could do, he recalled. It was the eerie calm after each explosion and scream. It explained everything. Shortly before dawn, the shelling subsided enough for Harun to peer out through the bunker entrance. He raised the Hessian flap. The half-torso of the 17-year-old girl lay across the threshold. He took a plastic mat and covered her. The old man was wandering about dazed. He didn't weep. "Here is the body of my granddaughter," he said to Harun. "And here is the body of my daughter, and that's the body of my granddaughter too." The gaunt old man wandered off into the gloom and smoke. Some 7 hours after it began, the shelling stopped and Harun emerged from the bunker. The sound of shelling and gunfire to the south continued to provide a roar that was at odds with the thin beauty of the early morning sunlight. A film of smoke and haze covered the field as though the whole earth had been burning and smouldering throughout the night. All around him he could see people bloodied and shocked, their clothes torn, rough bandages ripped from dresses and shirts covering a myriad of wounds. People were dragging themselves listlessly away, making for those vehicles that hadn't been hit, moving in a state of confusion and despair because they didn't know where to go that was safe. Others dug holes in which to bury their dead, and the sound of grief seemed to fill Harun's ears. He took pictures of the old man's family first. Somehow, he said, looking at them through a lens made it more bearable. I was back to work. I had a job to do, to record it, to make sure that people knew and that they wouldn't deny that this had happened. He shot the body of the pretty eldest girl first, the plastic mat pulled away to give a clear view. Then her mother, contorted and torn against a tree about 5 meters from her second daughter. And then the youngest of the granddaughters, a girl of around 13, on the verge of her adult life. He photographed the impact crater and the splash marks of the shell that had killed them, showing distinctly that it had traveled from the direction of the government lines. A shattered tree with the corpse of an infant suspended like a broken branch, a dead man with his children lying around, a fire, a mother and a young boy in a slumbering embrace, hardly roused by the blast that had destroyed their organs. He photographed a UN jeep sprinkled with the confetti of lethal shrapnel, mixed with the blood and body parts of the neighbours with whom he had briefly shared the field. The bunkers scored by hot fragmentation, and the scattered steel daggers from burst artillery rounds, some with their telltale production codes that added up to the scene of the murder of so many. That Sunday, the New York Times reported a memo sent to UN headquarters from Colombo, describing the experience of its staff in the government's no-fire zone. The memo said, "Our team on the ground was certain the shelling came from the Sri Lankan military, but apparently in response to a Tiger shell. All around them was the carnage from casualties from people who may have thought they were safer being near the UN. Sadly, they were wrong that night."